A couple now face federal charges in the death of their 2-year-old daughter, who died when a 50-pound suitcase fell on her neck. Her parents knowingly put this heavy suitcase on top of her crib so the little girl wouldn't escape when she was supposed to be sleeping. But then tragedy struck. All this happened back in 2022, but both her parents have just now been charged federally with involuntary manslaughter. The defendants in this case are Kodi Simon and Kateri Simon, who also goes by the name Kodi. Both parents are now 30 years old. But this incident happened back in 2022, so let's start there. At the time, the couple was living on the MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, Florida, where Kodi was serving as a U.S. Marine Corps Staff Sergeant. They lived on base with their 3 children, who at the time were ages 6, 4, and 2. That 2-year-old, the youngest, was their daughter Maeve. According to a report by the Florida Department of Children and Families, Maeve had some issues with sleeping ahead of her death. She would apparently climb out of her crib at night, mess up her room, and even wake up her other siblings. To stop all this, her parents started putting Maeve to sleep in a pack and play. According to court documents, when that didn't help, her parents covered this pack and play with a zip-on mesh top. They also put Maeve in a sleeping bag type sack that was supposed to restrict her movement. But even still, Maeve was able to escape the pack and play when she was supposed to be sleeping. At this point, her parents told police they began stacking a suitcase on top of the pack and play. They filled the suitcase with books to weigh it down, and in all it weighed about 50 pounds. They put the suitcase on top of the mesh covering of the pack and play and also covered it with their children's foam couch. That leads us to November 26, 2022. Kodi told police he put the kids to bed between 8:30 and 9 p.m. Kodi says he heard Maeve babble for the next 15 minutes, but thought she drifted off to sleep after that. Kodi came home a few hours later and went to bed, but the next morning at about 9:30, she found Maeve inside her pack and play, the suitcase pinning her down. She called 911 right away, but Maeve was pronounced dead when she arrived at the hospital. According to the report from the Department of Children and Families, quote, the parents knowingly placed items over the top of the toddler's pack and play in an effort to keep her confined inside. Although they were not doing it for discipline purposes, and although they were not willfully trying to harm her, their actions ultimately led to her demise. The report also noted there were no previous incidents with either parent, and both the other children seemed healthy and cared for. Following all this, Kodi faced a military trial or a court-martial on charges of child endangerment, negligent homicide, and involuntary manslaughter. The charging documents read in part, quote, Sergeant Kodi G. Simon did at or near redacted MacDill Air Force Base, Tampa, Florida, on or about 27 November 2022, had a duty for the care of redacted, that's his daughter, a child under the age of 16 years, and did endanger the safety of redacted, that's Maeve, by placing her in a portable crib with a foam mattress and a suitcase filled with books on top of the portable crib, and that such conduct constituted culpable negligence, which resulted in grievous bodily harm, to wit, mechanical asphyxiation resulting in death. Kodi pleaded guilty to child endangerment, but not guilty to negligent homicide and involuntary manslaughter. He was later sentenced to 1 year. But just this month, new charges came down for both Kodi and Kodi after they were indicted by a federal grand jury. The couple was arrested on January 16th in Ohio, where they now live. According to court records, they have both since been released but face 8 years in federal prison if they're convicted. So I'm here with Law&Crime legal analyst Julie Rendelman to talk a bit more about this case. And Julie, my first question is, this happened way back in 2022. Obviously a heartbreaking case, but the young girl died then. Why now are the parents facing charges?
So I think it took a bit of time to investigate. Remember, before the charges happened, I believe that the father, who was part of the military, was court-martialed, and I believe received a sentence of a year. There were a lot of proceedings going on before the eventual federal charges were handed down.
And you're right about the court-martial situation, which I wanted to ask you about too, because I don't know much aside from a few good men. How does that factor into federal charges? I mean, it wouldn't be double jeopardy, right? If he faced charges in the court-martial and then is charged again. I mean, do you know anything about that?
So it's definitely not double jeopardy. It's a different system altogether. Can it have an impact? Yeah, I'll be frank here. I'm guessing in a case like this, where there is so much tragedy, for the loss of this child, and quite frankly for the parents, who, remember, are not charged with any type of intentionality, but merely some more recklessness. That my guess, this is going to be the type of case that is resolved way before trial.
That leads into my next question because we did see him plead guilty to some of the charges in the court martial situation. Do you think that's something that would happen here too in the federal case, that they would end in plea deals before either case would ever go to trial?
Absolutely. As to what he and his wife plead to, that's a different story. But I certainly don't see this as the type of case that we're going to see going to trial, particularly in regards to the father, who already was sentenced to a year regarding his court martial. So I see a resolution way before we ever see a trial.
And this is something you pointed out in one of your answers previously to this. It doesn't seem that there was any intention by either parent, any malice of any sort. It just was something that happened seemingly as an accident. So they're charged in relation to all of that. Is that what the defense is going to focus on? That these parents had two other healthy children, no harm to them. They didn't mean for this to happen. It just happened.
Yeah, I look, it is a tragic accident, but keep in mind, the argument from the federal indictment is that it was an accident, but it was an avoidable accident, because the assumption is when you place a 50-pound piece of luggage that's filled with books on the top of a pack and play, the potential is that there's going to be serious injury, especially when the child is 2 years old and is not able to fend for themselves if the objects fall on top of them, which is what inevitably happened. But they recognize in this indictment, because remember, they're not charged with murder, they're charged with involuntary manslaughter, that it wasn't purposely done. And the defense's position is going to be several things. One is that it was an accident. They didn't realize what would happen. Two, I think they're also going to focus on the fact that, just as you said, they had two other children that were healthy. There was no indication they had been neglecting any of the children, and that they have in many ways grieved and suffered enough for what they have done.
And it does seem like they have, based on the social media posts I've seen about Maeve and the rest of the family. It seems like they have really been through it, and this was a terrible accident. I do have to wonder, though, you were talking about them knowingly putting these books in the suitcase because, according to reports, it weighed about 50 pounds. So that is obviously doing that intentionally to keep her inside her pack and play. But I'm wondering if potentially this part could be highlighted. According to a report by the Department of Family and Children, this little girl was an escape artist. So she would get out of her pack and play, her crib, she would leave, wreak havoc on the house, who knows what she was doing. And I'm wondering if the defense could maybe say, hey, we were trying to keep her in there because we didn't know what would happen if everyone was asleep. She could harm herself that way.
It's such an incredible point, because and it seems clear that there was no malice. This wasn't some type of punishment for this child. And in fact, the argument they made was that when they're sleeping, they were worried she would hurt herself if she got out of the crib and was on her own, because she's only 2 years old. The question comes down to is what their response was. It an appropriate, rational, reasonable response that in order to keep her in, they would use the objects they did. And so you're right. I think it's going to be, and it is part of their defense. I also think it's why the charges are at the lower level that they are, because there's a recognition that there is certainly mitigation that surrounds what happened.
And I mean, hindsight is 2020. We can say it over and over again that the parents didn't intentionally cause this. And you talked about how this is not a murder charge. So I wanted to highlight that too, because it is involuntary manslaughter. So based on this allegation of this young girl's death and how she died, do you think involuntary manslaughter is the appropriate charge?
So I think it's the appropriate charge. As to whether or not at the end of the day it's going to be what they plead to, that's another story. I don't think there's any evidence that we've heard or seen that indicates anything more, that these were intentional acts, that there was any malice whatsoever. In fact, quite frankly, as we talked about, it's the opposite. This was an effort to protect the child and protect the rest of the family. I just think, unfortunately, they went about it in a quite an incredibly reckless way, without recognition of what the possibilities would be, which is kind of what involuntary manslaughter is. And so, so the charges seem to fit as to whether or not that's what they're going to plead to, whether they're going to plead to lesser counts, and what the ultimate sentence is. That's a whole other issue.
Now, going off what may happen, a plea deal potentially, we'll see that down the line. But the maximum sentence that either of these parents could face is 8 years behind bars. Do you think that's likely? I mean, that's almost a decade. And of course, we have to consider they would be taken away from their two other children.
Yeah, I really don't think it's likely. And I certainly hope that that is not the result. I will note one thing, which I think is interesting. There is potentially a distinction between the two of them. Remember, they're both charged. However, he was the one who was home and allegedly put the child in that evening with the luggage over. She came in afterwards. And so I'm curious what the evidence is going to be against her. Was it that she had done it in the past, that she knew it was up there and didn't do anything about it? So there also, keep in mind, there might be a distinction as to what the sentences are in regards to him versus her.
I'm glad you brought that up. Going through all of this, that's exactly what I was thinking because she came home after the suitcase was already on top of the pack and play. But then if we're going back to the report from the Department of Children and Family Services, apparently they had tried other things in the past to keep this little girl in her pack and play. And it's possible that they did this suitcase thing beforehand and she may have partook in it then. I mean, is that something we're really going to focus on? Prosecutors saying it happened in the past or the defense saying, hey, she wasn't even there for it?
Well, it depends. I mean, remember, there's two different defense attorneys that are going to be defending each of them. And the goal is, obviously to protect your own client. And if the distinction is that the mother was unaware at the time that this happened, that the child, that the luggage was where it was, then that is obviously going to be a defense. The question is, did she check on the child and saw that the child was okay and then went to sleep? Was she aware before she got home that her husband had done that because they'd done in the past? And that was kind of the plan and agreement between the two of them, that that's what they were going to do to keep the child in place. I think all these questions are going to be explored, but I really do think it's possible when we talk about sentencing and the hope that neither of them get an extensive amount of time, considering they both have children, that there may be a distinction between the two sentences between mom and dad.
Talking about the other children too, because as we've pointed out, it seems that they were healthy, cared for young children who obviously still have this relationship with their parents. I'm wondering if investigators would talk to both of them. At the time, they were ages 4 and 6, so pretty young. Memory might be different. I'm sure they would have talked to them the day of. But let's pretend this does go to jury trial. Would we potentially hear from either of these kids? They're still pretty young.
Yeah, I hope not. The expectation, again, we hope that this won't amount to a trial. Obviously, if one of the children has something incredibly significant that has a huge impact on the case, then maybe you would hear from them. I think one of the things, Sierra, that stood out to me, and again, this is just from the records we've been reading, is they had been to the doctors in regards to this child. There had been discussions, the one that died, I believe Maeve, and they had discussed the fact that she had some type of speech delays. One thing they never discussed, apparently, with the doctors was the fact that she had sleep issues. So that might be something that the prosecution raises to say, well, if this really was an issue, if this was something of such concern and that they had tried every single thing, why weren't they talking to their doctor about it, who could have given them better guidance? Instead, highly doubtful that the doctor would be the one telling them to put 50 pounds of luggage on a pack and play.
We still have a lot of questions about this case, talking about the federal indictment too. This is going to be my last question for you, Julie. This indictment just basically lays out what they're charged with: involuntary manslaughter. But it doesn't read to me like a criminal complaint that I've seen many other times where it says this happened on this day. It just is pretty straightforward and doesn't give us many details. Is this normal in the federal system, or could there be an additional document that could explain things a bit further?
So sometimes we have, whether it be federal or state indictments, charges that spell out everything, that give you kind of the nuts and bolts of the case. And then there's sometimes they really just provide you with the charges. It doesn't mean you're not going to hear more down the line. The charging document does not have to give all the details, and often it doesn't.
Still curious about some of the details, but overall, we can just say this is such a heartbreaking case for the friends and family of this little girl. Julie Rendelman, thank you for coming on and talking with us about this case.
Thank you as always for having me.
Before we end, let's make sure to pay respects to Maeve, the 2-year-old girl in this case. Here's how she's remembered according to a GoFundMe page. Quote, Maeve was a loving, sweet, rambunctious little joy. She lost her life in a tragic accident at the sweet age of only 2. She was the light to many people's lives. Although she is gone from this world, she will remain in the hearts of all who knew her. Our worlds will never be the same. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Gillespie.